introduce you to Robin Mellon. Robin Mellon is the CEO of Better Sydney, but from his title alone, you probably wouldn't get much of a depth of understanding on Robin's depth of understanding and depth of experience in dealing with not just broader sustainable supply chain management and addressing unsustainable supply chain problems, but more recently over probably the last, I don't know, Robin, you're probably best to tell, but over the last 5 to 10 years, he's been really focusing on or providing expertise on modern slavery as part of that sustainable supply chain management. So I'll hand over. Robin probably is best to tell you a little bit more about his experience, but I'll hand you over to Robin and he can talk to you about this topic, which is really about the benefits of collaboration in modern slavery. So we talk about the benefits of collaboration that's part of AusLSA's model. It has a specific importance and specific benefits when dealing with modern slavery and dealing with modern slavery, especially in Australia. So without further ado, Robin.
Thanks, Richard. And I know you've started recording the session, which will be great because then hopefully if people missed it, they can catch up later. Thank you everyone for joining. I'd love to make this more conversational. If you have questions as we go, you can either wait until the end and ask them there, or if you've got questions about something that I'm talking about in particular, then please do let me know, pop them in the chat box, and we can deal with those as we go. It's quite difficult. The brief that Richard gave me was quite high level, and I can talk about collaboration till the cows come home. I'll try and zoom in on a couple of good examples where it's really working well, and a couple of different sectors. But again, if there's things you'd like to tease out, please do let me know. As Richard mentioned, I won't sort of give you the whole bio. I've had a career in and around sustainability for the last few decades. Really originally was in sort of built environment. How do we build it sustainably? But really I've decided to specialize after sort of 9 years with the Green Building Council. Had multiple years with the Supply Chain Sustainability School before moving on and working still with built environment, but also starting up Better Sydney. And my 4 areas of expertise are around, yes, sustainability in all its formats, environmental, economic, social, but also around education. So how do we get information across to people in a manner that they can use it? Around supply chains, what do our supply chains and our procurement processes look like? And then around human rights and modern slavery, and how does that play out in different national or international supply chains? So kind of those 4 interlocking circles. As I said, I don't want to make this, a lecture. I've purposefully not put together slides because I'd like to have more of a conversation today. And I would guess, following the conversation with Richard and Kelvin, that I don't need to go into details about modern slavery, about the 8 types of exploitation that make up modern slavery, about the 40.3 million people globally, or even about the Modern Slavery Act 2018. I do note that there's a review of the Modern Slavery Act coming up this year. The terms are being worked on. Some have been released, but the references are going to be released, I think, middle of May or late May. So that will be taking place this year, and I can come back to that and touch on that a bit later. I'm also happy to talk about statements. If you have questions about modern slavery statements or the reporting process, I probably won't go into details about individual statements or comparison of one organization over another. I'm happy to say that yes, there are ones that I consider excellent, like Woolworths Group. I probably won't name the less than excellent, but there are many of those out there amongst the thousands online. What I will say is that I find it just extraordinary that already over 750,000 views through the Modern Slavery Register, which means that people are looking at these statements, and that's possibly the most important part. People are looking at what's publicly available, and they're not just looking by individual company name. They're not just comparing company A and B. They're looking by sector. So they're searching by seafood or shoes or cars, or they're looking at multiple things. So there's a lot of interest already in these. What I might do is dive into an example of collaboration, and one that I've been working on very closely over the last 4 years, and that's around the Property Council and the property and construction sector working group and supplier platform. And I might explore that for a few minutes and sort of explain some of the principles and what we do and how it works. And that way, if you have questions, we can unpick those, or I can talk about other examples from other sectors as well. Back in 2016, 2017, the Property Council have their National Sustainability Roundtable, which meets frequently, but they have an annual, strategy session to work out, what are the sustainability issues coming up. And back in 2016-17, two of the things that were coming up really hot were firstly supply chains, which I'm always glad to see, and secondly, human rights and modern slavery, because there was a lot of talk after the UK had introduced the Modern Slavery Act in 2015 there, should Australia be doing the same? And so there was the sort of preliminary discussions going on. After those two, supply chain and modern slavery, after those two topics came up as priorities, they put together a working group, essentially, of the organisations that said, yes, this is important for us, we want to keep discussing this and look at what opportunities there are to collaborate. And that working group has now been meeting once a month since then. And I took over project management of that about 3 years ago, and I've been working very closely with that working group. They were looking essentially at opportunities to collaborate because, what shared opportunities were there, given, that each of those property and construction firms, big firms like Lendlease that work internationally, or, more local Australia, New Zealand ones like Mirvac, what opportunities were there? They each have thousands, many thousands of suppliers across Australia and worldwide. But also, of course, many of those will be shared suppliers. So supplier X may work to 10 of those big companies. So how do we make things easier for the suppliers, but also get the data out in a much more reliable and, reportable way? And so getting together that working group was a way of looking, they have shared suppliers, they have similar objectives, they're trying to be profitable businesses, but they also have shared environmental goals and targets, maybe around net zero, or around minimizing waste or food waste, or water use, or all of these things, albeit with different ways of getting there, different ways of getting to zero carbon. Just as an aside, the Property Council, as many industry associations, also has, they have a social sustainability working group and different initiatives, and they have ones around, low carbon and energy efficiency and all of those. But the Modern Slavery Working Group came together 3-4 years ago to really look at the specific opportunities around that. Now, apart from the desire to work together, to collaborate, one of the first objectives was really to review the supply chain and human rights and modern slavery supplier platforms available across the market, Australia and overseas, and decide, whether to collaborate around one of those in order to get the right data to report under the Modern Slavery Act, or whether something new needed to be created. And 3-4 years ago, that we went through that process of review, the desktop review, looking at a lot of the ones that existed already, things like SEDEX or CM3 or all of those platforms, many of which are very advanced and have great abilities. What was decided then was that it would probably be better to create a new thing, a new supplier platform, for the simple reason that it could then be tailored, new questions could be introduced to make it much more relevant to the property and construction sector, but also to get the right information around reporting requirements. How do we essentially ask the questions that we can then take the answers to report against the 7 criteria within the Modern Slavery Act 2018? It was also felt, and this is not against any particular platform that may be out there, that what was needed was something that could be agile. So as an example, and I'm happy to come back to this later if you have questions, one of the red hot issues at the moment is around forced labour and forced Uyghur labour from Shanxi province in China within global solar panel supply chains. So this has been an issue rising in prominence since last since last March. A report came out, Sheffield Hallam in the UK last May. There's been a lot of work going on since then, but essentially forced Uyghur labour in global solar panel supply chains. It is an increasingly prominent issue, but we needed a question set or a supplier platform that could add new questions. So as the issue arose, whether it's top glove and PPE from Malaysia, as we saw during the pandemic, or global the solar panel supply chains, how do we introduce a new question pretty much overnight, if there is agreement from across the working group, from across the platform partners, to start addressing and drilling down into those risks? So the reason we went with building a new platform under that sort of collaborative idea was so that it could be agile, so that we could introduce things really quite quickly. So the working group went with Informed 365, who essentially built the platform, developed the question set, working with myself, working with Edge Environment, working with a number of experts to sort of peer review it, and building in data sets, because of course, you know, property companies are not usually experts in you know, the human rights data. So building in, of course, the global slavery index, UNICEF, my brain's gone completely blank. There are 6 data sets, Exio-base, peer-reviewed data, all sorts of building in those 6 data sets to look at areas of high risk, so geographical areas of high risk, as well as particular sectors or materials or product or supply chains that are seen as high risk as well. An important note, which may head off somebody's question before we get to it, is how to work together in a manner that is collaborative without being anti-competitive, without being collusive, or in a way that would not be considered cartel conduct. I don't know whether anyone can hear the chainsaw that's just started up behind me. If you give me 1 second, I'm just going to close all the windows. I will be right back. 1 second, because it's quite off-putting for me. 1 second. All right, sorry, I've closed all the windows. Hopefully that is less noticeable. It is marginally better for me, so hopefully we can work through that. One of the challenges, how to work together in a manner that is collaborative without being seen as anti-competitive or collusive, or in a way that could be considered cartel conduct. So we have been obviously very careful as we go through with each meeting. We don't talk about price, we don't talk about particular suppliers, and we have essentially created a set of principles, and we're developing a set of guidelines now, which we revisit at the start of every meeting, just to make sure that we are not sort of, you know, a group of clients getting together to discuss price, or at any stage particular suppliers or particular supply chains. And we, you know, are reminded of those regularly, particularly around sensitive issues, as I said, like global solar panel supply chains. So we come back to that on a regular basis, and Hayley Jarrick, formerly from the Governance Institute, has been helping to inform that. So I'll get onto the collaboration principles in a moment, but it has been something that we come back to regularly. It's also been important not to have any siloed thinking. I know, you know, Australia is the world's largest island, sort of stuck over here, tends to think much more about Australian supply chains and going out. But what we've also come back to many, many times is the other pieces of legislation worldwide. So obviously the 2012 California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, a decade ago now, the 2015 UK Modern Slavery Act, and then of course from January next year, Germany's Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, which will be expanded into that further human rights legislation across the European Union. So part of that sort of collaboration objective is to come back to what is happening in other countries, what can we learn from, but also which of our supply chains are going to those areas, and how can we come back to some of the issues which are being raised in those countries or sectors or geographical areas. I mentioned a moment ago the principles. So one of the things we did at the beginning of this collaboration in setting up the Modern Slavery Working Group and Supplier Platform, one of the things we did was set up 7 key principles for the project. We come back to those regularly, and I am still very glad we did it because it helps to inform the conversation, but it also helps to shut down things when, how do I put this? Particularly eager people say, oh, we could do this, we could take it in this direction. It's useful to be able to say, well, we could, and that would in itself be fascinating, but the 7 original principles were to do this, and we need to keep doing these things in order to fulfill sort of this project brief before we start taking it in another direction. So the 7 principles, and I will circulate these via Richard and Kelvin afterwards, just so that everyone has got them. They're in the public record. The 7 principles for this collaboration were to, 1, reduce administration. So the whole point of collaborating, setting up a supplier platform, was to reduce administration, decrease the admin burden on supply chain partners. So not just for the partners using the platform, but for the suppliers, reducing the amount of administration. So, for example, if you're a supplier, you should only have to fill this in once rather than 41 times for the 41 current partners across the property and construction sector. The second was to limit costs for suppliers, and this has been a really important principle of the collaboration. The assessment is free for suppliers to complete. So a supplier, whether it's a sole trader or a large multinational, they will receive an email saying, your client Stockland is inviting you to complete this assessment online. It is free to do so. Now, it will take for a sole trader probably between 12 and 15 minutes once a year to complete. For a larger company, so multinational with more complex policies or procedures, it may take a couple of hours, but it's an annual thing, and then you can update that as you go. But the assessment is free for suppliers to complete. The third and possibly most important to my my role in this is to encourage supplier education. So all the way through, the supplier platform is built to be an educational process. So it may ask questions about, for example, grievance mechanisms, but then it will give a definition, what grievance mechanisms are, and it will provide links to free resources, to case studies, to online resources, the UN Global Compact resources on grievance mechanisms and the case studies, for example. And there's, I think, 44 different resources linked through at different points throughout, some of which are training courses, some of which are videos, but we've made it an educational process with the idea that if people don't know what X means, grievance mechanisms, or remediation, what does remediation mean? There are ways in which people can then look at that and improve over time. The fourth of the principles was to enable transparency. So it's important both to the industry and all suppliers that you could see who was involved, you could see how data was being moved around, but also you could make sure that the question set is available, it's open source, it's in the public realm. All of the resources are in the public realm. They're provided in a PDF. So it's a very transparent process, and you can have a look at any stage where the information is. The fifth is to improve data access. So suppliers, again, whether small or large, can see their own data, can see the answers they provided to questions year on year, and they can elect who to share it with. So if they want to share it with Stockland, to whom they already supply, but they also want to provide the data to Mervac, who they don't yet supply to, they can do that. And it really is a case of ticking a box and choosing who they supply it with. And at any stage, they can untick that and cease sharing the data. So that's all recorded there. The sixth principle is to make the platform more available, so for a broader group of property companies. And it was, I won't say a little bit scary, but to begin with, there was just 15 property and construction firms involved. Those were the core working group members. We're now up to 41 property and construction firms representing the leaders across Australia, New Zealand, and the Asia Pacific, representing about $1.65 trillion worth of funds and properties under management. So it's really sort of hitting its straps now. And the seventh one, tying back to the what I was saying, competition and collusion, or making sure nothing is anti-competitive or collusive, was to keep the platform impartial. So the information that is provided by suppliers, if I go in and I fill out the assessment as a supplier, that is presented impartially for Property Council members to carry out their own analysis. So the platform doesn't say this is a high risk supplier, this is a low risk supplier, or this is compliant or non-compliant, or anything like that. It simply allows the platform partners to process the information, to overlay their own criteria in order to say this represents more risk to us or less risk to us, or this is compliant with our policy around human rights and ethical sourcing, or it is not compliant. So the platform doesn't say anything. It's up for each individual supplier partner or platform partner to set those criteria in different places. We've now got, from this morning's look, we've now got 6,149 suppliers invited to the supplier platform. So there's, thousands of sets of supplier data there across multiple sectors, because of course some of those will be insurance firms providing insurance, or they'll sell toilet paper or building products or property services. So it goes across multiple sectors really quickly. Lots of different sizes, so we can look at that by number of employees or by annual consolidated revenue, and we can track that geographically. So there are sort of maps within it which allow us to track supply chains and to see areas of risk across supply chains. We can also look year on year, and that's where I can nerd out with my supply chain brain, and I can look at how things are changing year on year around human rights or some of the interlinked issues. As I mentioned, all of those materials, the question set, the PDF of educational resources, they're all available for free online. It's open source. I'm happy to provide those afterwards if people are interested. And just a reminder, I know I said it earlier, it is designed to essentially to flex with the type of suppliers that are using it. So if a sole trader goes through, essentially, if you don't hire people from overseas, it folds up that whole section, so there's just one question. If you answer yes to that, there's another 4 questions, and if you answer yes to any of those, more questions unfold. So it's designed to flex around the level of risk and the size of the supplier using it. It is interesting to see how many shared suppliers there are. There are, thousands of those are shared suppliers. They're supplying to more than one, and so there's, considerable, not just economies of scale, but for the suppliers, making it much, much quicker than answering individual assessments. And it's also interesting to see where the changes are occurring. For example, the question, fairly blunt question, do you have a modern slavery policy or policies that relate to these things? It's interesting to see over the last 3 years how quickly that is changing to, yes, we have some sort of policy around ethical procurement or ethical sourcing that covers off modern slavery. And I think that's a good thing. It's not that having a policy necessarily does anything, but it's interesting to see the change in thinking and to start to link those around. And I'll be careful how I say this, because this is not about any particular companies, but to me, as an expert in this area, I find it fascinating that the biggest risks aren't necessarily where we thought they would be around particular materials or particular countries, but they are in the unknowns. So what we're finding is that, some questions have yes, no, don't know. One of them, and I've got it written here because I can never remember the wording exactly. Does your organization or your labor hire provider recruit any employees or workers from overseas, such as temporary or casual migrant workers? I'll read that again, just so that you've got your head around that. Does your organization or labor hire provider recruit any employees or workers from overseas, such as temporary or casual migrant workers? So the options are yes, no, and don't know. And of course, from memory, it's about 90% have said no, they don't. There's probably about 7 or 8% that have said yes, we do, and you can immediately click and see who those are and what processes they may use, what policies, what protocols they have to manage that. But what I find fascinating are the 3 or 4% that have said they don't know. They don't know whether they recruit any employees from workers from overseas. And it's these areas of unknowns, and to get all to Donald Rumsfeld's one, the unknown unknowns in particular, that are the biggest risk, because this is where we have suppliers who quite literally don't know how or where they're hiring people. And those are the risks that we can start to dig into and ask further questions to try and uncover. Now, other collaborations, that's sort of a deep dive on the Property Council. We still have the monthly meetings with the working group. We go through particular issues. We're talking tomorrow morning about the Modern Slavery Act review. We're talking about global solar panel supply chains. We're talking about sort of key issues that that evolve around those. But it's been a really positive process, albeit, you know, people sub in and sub out. So out of those 15, there's probably 2 or 3 that, you know, were on the original group 3 or 4 years ago, but otherwise there are representatives from those organisations. What I will say, and I don't think this is any different with the Inform 365 platform or any others that might be used, is that every company, every organisation involved is using it in slightly different ways. Some are not as mature, and they're quite literally using it to sort suppliers into a binary, you know, are these good? Are these compliant suppliers? Can we report on them? Or are they higher risk? Are they non-compliant suppliers? So some of them are really using the data in quite a blunt way. Others are much more complex. They've created weighted score sheets in spreadsheets, and they're using it to work out which suppliers need more time invested in them over the next 2 years and how they resource that up. So every single one of the organizations collaborating is using the information differently, and that's really healthy. I'm really glad that's happening. Of course, you know, the laggards get swept along a bit by the leaders, and the leaders get held back a bit by the laggards, but overall that's a healthy process, and we've managed to keep the, you know, the body of people moving along together. Now, other collaborations that I've been working alongside or project managing include CMA, so the Complementary Medicines Australia. So I've been working closely with Blackmores the last few years, you know them, vitamins, complementary medicines, but we run an annual workshop with the CMA. Again, many of their members are in very different places. That's to be expected across the sector, but it's a very good way, at least with an annual workshop, of looking at where people are at that risk appetite, but also their understanding about where the risks are and who is ready to move on those. And what I have seen, and this is probably just as relevant to AusLSA as it is to complementary medicines or property or any other organisation, there is still a misunderstanding about what risk really means. In some circles, risk of modern slavery, is about risk of harm to the organisation, is about risk of reputational damage or market risk or financial risk or operational risk, social licence to operate. Very few organisations have really grasped that we're talking about risk of harm to people. And that falls at the heart of the Modern Slavery Act, and it needs to be brought back up in every risk matrix that is considered by every board meeting, that we're not necessarily talking about reputational damage risk. That's definitely part of it, but we need to have risk of harm to people at the top with the others underneath it. And then there is the sort of the general term about risk in terms of likelihood, probability of something happening, probability of something being uncovered. And so there needs to be a much more careful examination of what risk actually means here. So I mentioned Complementary Medicines Australia. There's another group collaboration around mining and resources. They have a regular working group meeting and a shared supplier survey, which is available in PDF. You can have a look there. I've been project managing we call it the Purpose collaboration, but essentially it's not-for-profit organisations, including the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, Australian Red Cross, GenU. They've developed, again, a platform, a supplier platform, which Inform 365 is running for them, but they added some core principles. So I mentioned the 7 core principles for collaboration earlier. They've added 2 more, which is really healthy, which reflects their slightly different objectives. So the 2 they've added, they want to influence positive change. So they want to apply leverage towards greater collaboration and awareness with suppliers. And they want to promote social procurement. So they want to empower the broader social procurement movement. So they're spreading their wings a little bit further and looking at those issues. Time-wise, just checking in, Calvin, I've probably got about 5 more minutes of content, so I'll keep going if I may, and then we can get to questions as we go on. I was talking about the Purpose collaboration, which is another good example. Another, which is perhaps much more sector specific, is the AAA. So I'm going to struggle with this one, the Australian Automotive Afterparts Association. So essentially, car parts. And it's a group of automotive manufacturers and suppliers and after parts providers and distributors that have got together to look at a much more specific set of supply chains around the materials and the labour that go into them. But again, it's a really good example of a sector coming together and having a really tight brief to look at what they're meant to be doing and the particular risks of harm to people around what they make and produce and install and distribute. And then there's other examples of collaborations. I've been working with Norco, one of Australia's biggest dairy cooperatives, at what is possible there and what can be done collectively around dairy and agricultural organisations within Australia. So there's some really diverse and wonderful examples of collaboration. Now, where I wanted to end was, I'm sorry, I have a list brain, so I tend to shuffle things into lists. I'm happy to circulate these afterwards, but I've shuffled things into 7 priorities for the 12 months ahead. This is one of the questions that I'm asked most when I'm talking with people. So what should we be doing? And so I've sort of shuffled these into 7 priorities, which I'll run through and circulate. The first is about knowing your supply chains better. I think the first year or two, whether we're talking about a law firm or your clients or broader, I think knowing your supply chains better and understanding the detail and the data sets around what's going on in order to report yourself, but also understand where the risks are for your clients, for your peers, for your suppliers. And I think we're only just starting to get to grips with the data that's becoming available about our suppliers and about the risk of harm to people and where those lie. So one is knowing supply chains better and getting into the detail of those. Second is knowing the risks better. I mentioned, the need to focus on the risk of harm to people, not risk to the organisation. So again, we need much more detail about the risks, where those lie geographically or by supply chain or sector or particular materials like lithium or cobalt, which in solar panels are fast becoming a hot issue. But we need much more detail about those emerging risks. The third one, and this sounds much bigger than it is, but is about educating, engaging and empowering your operational staff. So the Modern Slavery Act looks at operations, your own internal staff and people employed, and then your supply chains. So educating, engaging and empowering your operational staff. Organizations of every size, whether it's a small organization like mine or a big multinational, they need to be formalizing and expanding their plans to educate and engage and empower their own staff about key human rights and modern slavery issues. And that ranges from the notional, how to spot the signs. How do you spot the signs? What are the signs of modern slavery? What does it look like? How do people present? How are these situations or these types of exploitation all linked? What does it look like? To the practical, what do you do when you are concerned? If you're concerned that someone is in a bad place or bad condition, or you've spoken to something and something doesn't feel right, what do you do? Either internal mechanism or external. And number 4 is about educating and engaging your suppliers and supply chains, because once you've done your own stuff, you need to turn to your suppliers, and they can be all sorts of suppliers across every different sector. But again, giving them the ability to either access grievance mechanisms or to speak up, but at the very least to know your expectations around human rights in your procurement practices. Number 5, perhaps obviously, is improving your grievance mechanisms and the ability to listen to staff and suppliers. Lots of organizations have, a speak up hotline or an email address or, an online, externally managed application or, Whisply or WhatsApp groups, depending on country. And I think these need to be rolled out and formalized and made much more accessible to people inside the organization, but also outside to your suppliers or peers, so that people are familiar with how to speak up, with how to voice concerns, but also make sure that they're effective, they're accessible by the people who need to access them, they're reflective, there's an improvement loop regularly, and reliable and predictable. People know what will happen with the information. Number 6 is establishing and improving your remediation protocol. So remediation is sort of an 8-stage, an 8-phase involved process, from speaking up, voicing the concern at the beginning, through to ensuring that it never happens again. But a lot of the middle part is about safeguarding the victims, the survivors, and making sure that the information is processed in a way that safeguards them, but also can ensure that it doesn't happen again. And I think making sure that remediation is handled well involves multiple people, and that's a great area for collaboration, as is the need for better grievance mechanisms. And then lastly, number 7, this is a particular passion area for me, so I'll try and keep this short, but connecting human rights and modern slavery initiatives with other ESG processes. And again, this is where I can talk for hours, and I'll try to keep it short, but it's woeful, the number of companies I see that sort of have modern slavery being dealt with by itself in a silo over here by one person, and then not connecting it to the climate change ambitions or net zero ambitions over here, or diversity and inclusion goals over here, because they're all inextricably linked. And if you, whether it's a law firm or a construction firm or a dairy, if you actually want to see change here, the big levers that you can pull are, for example, around educating and empowering women and girls, which will in turn have massive impacts around human rights and modern slavery, because 71% of the people in modern slavery are women and girls, around diversity inclusion, around innovation and entrepreneurialism in your supply chains, around climate. Diversity is one of the second biggest and most cost-effective ways of improving, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So connecting modern slavery initiatives in with the other ESG processes. Where I'll leave things, just my last 2 points. One is on supplier diversity. One of the things that has come out of the pandemic most visibly for me is how we have all put our procurement eggs in too few baskets, sometimes just in one basket. So we have one supplier for something, which gives us no resilience. If that supply chain is interrupted by the pandemic, by a human rights incident, we have no alternatives. We cannot say to the supplier, if you do not improve things, the human rights within the supply chain over time, we will go elsewhere if we have nowhere else to go. And so the lack of supplier diversity that we have cemented into our supply chains is really quite shameful. And I think, yes, it's a very big thing to say, but we need to be looking at improving supplier diversity across all sorts of things so that we can, one, not be brought up short by supply chain shocks, but secondly, we have alternatives when we find human rights abuses. And where I'll leave it at is just on the review of the Act. So the review of the Act will be happening, as I said, this year. It's going to be looking at the operation of the Act, compliance with the Act. Where I'm fascinated, so additional measures to improve compliance. What needs to happen? Is that around education? Is that around resources? How do we improve the operation of the Act? And then some of the details, the appropriateness of the $100 million reporting entity threshold. Now, I have no opinion on that. I think it may be too early to bring that down, but I think we need to flag that should, come down to 50 million in 3 years' time, when we've got the current reporting entities into the right stride and asking the right questions. And then lastly, whether it's necessary for an independent body, such as an anti-slavery commissioner, to oversee the implementation and enforcement of the Act. 100% yes. I've said that over the last 8 years, and I think we need to be stepping that up. Whether we will see that under the current government, I don't know, but it's certainly an issue for the next government to be formed. That's where I'll leave it. I feel like I've been talking at you for hours. Sorry, that wasn't a very conversational thing. That was just a volley of words towards you. But now would be a good time if you have questions.
Hi everybody, it's Kelvin here. I'm hearing a lot of feedback. That's better. Richard had to unfortunately leave us in the meeting, so if you do have any questions, you can either put up your hand using the reactions button or use the chat, or it's quite often difficult to type a long question. So if you want to turn your microphone on and ask a question, that's perfectly acceptable as well. I might start off with a couple of observations that I made along the way, Robin. That from a law firm's point of view, I mean, when I was at Henry Davis Shaw before they merged with Norton Rose, years ago when we were undertaking the Corporate Responsibility Index, supply chain management and sustainable supply chain management, call it what you will, was something that was important then, and people talked about having a supply chain code of conduct that they had to tick the box to say yes, they did, that they did the right thing. In many respects, the law firm's at the end of the supply chain. So if a law firm said, right, we want to buy 400 more computers from the Acme Computer Company, and the Acme Computer Company will get their motherboards from one place, their silicon from somewhere else, their metals from somewhere else, their lithium from somewhere else. If the Acme Computer Company ticked the box to say, yes, we're compliant, we really have to take that on face value because we don't have the resources to go any further with that. So that's, we're taking a leap of faith to say that our suppliers are actually telling us the truth, and to then look at your point about having resilience in your supply chain. So we'll have 2 or 3 computer suppliers on the hook. How do we manage that? Because law firms have got their day jobs and everything else to do, and the people that are responsible for all of these tasks, notwithstanding, educating and empowering their operational staff better. The difficulty would be arising in how we actually audit any of this stuff and do anything more than just take it on face value.
So good question, Calvin. And again, being faced across multiple sectors, I guess I'll split my answer into 4 parts.
Sorry, can I? There's a few people saying that their cameras and their mics are disabled. If you can, once you've dealt with my question, I'll enable Gemma McKinnon and then Tamara Sims and Emma, just so they can also ask some questions. Sorry.
No, that's all right. I've lost where I was. Firstly, this is a multi-year issue, so it's going to be a case of how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time. It's not a fixing all supply chains immediately. The second is about prioritizing. So that's a good example. Laptops, lots of ingredients in a laptops coming from multiple countries. 48 probable countries for a typical laptop at the moment. What you do is you can prioritize the particular areas of risk of harm to people and then start to work with those companies. What we've done with the Property Council, for example, is each of the platform partners nominated, I'm doing this from memory, 5 suppliers that they wanted to see audited. So that's not the right word, verified. And so Bureau Veritas went back and did essentially a verification process against the information provided to flag up areas of higher or lower risk. And so that's come back. And again, collaboratively, that's great, because if if each property company nominates 5 people, collectively, they can then see 60 audit results or verification results. And so they're working through, in terms of priorities, things like cobalt or lithium or, plastics or, precious metals, in order to work their way through those. I think, as you were saying, being very clear about the procurement principles that your organization, whether a law firm or small business, is following is going to be really clear, and those could be around the ISO 2400, the International Standard for Sustainable Procurement, to embed the procurement principles and communicate those regularly with your suppliers, whether they're for laptops or for solar panels or for toilet paper. But essentially, it means that you can communicate those regularly and then start to make decisions around those and prioritize the areas where the risks of harm to people are greater.